I am Caroline Whitaker, 39. After 5 years of silence, a cream envelope from my mother sat me back at a white table in Boston. My brother lifted his glass and called me the disgrace of our family. About 10 minutes later, his fiancée stopped behind my chair, dipped on instinct, and said the two words that changed the room, Your Honor. In that breath, the past tried to make me small and the present asked me to stand up straight. If your dignity were dragged across the table in front of your own parents, what would you do? Stay with me at Salvatore's, and I will show you the 3 quiet moves that kept me steady, drew a bright line, and let the truth take off its own mask. The private room at Salvatore's breathed butter and lemon and the faint cologne of men who had spent their lives in white coats. Linen glowed under lamplight. Silver waited like a promise. I smoothed the deep green dress that made my shoulders feel squared and steady, and kept my fingers curled around the pocket watch in my palm, the one with EJW, etched in tired gold. My grandfather's weight in my hand steadied the air in my chest. Mother sat on my right, a slim figure in a navy sheath, pearls laid neat along her collarbone. Father took the end of the table as if it were a ward he had run for decades. He did not look at me, not quite. He inspected bread as if a surgeon could diagnose intentions from a baguette. Across from me, Andrew laughed too loudly at something the anesthesiologist said, then lifted his glass with the smooth confidence that had always attached itself to him like a second skin. To the family he announced, voice round and warm. To legacy and excellence. His gaze slid to me and sharpened, and to the courage to accept who contributes and who does not. A few smiles hesitated. He let the room lean his way. You are an embarrassment to this family, he said, finally pleasant as a server offering dessert. A disgrace to this family. The words skated down my spine and sat cold at the small of my back. The room did not gasp. It tightened. Mother set her hand over mine, a small firm weight that said, Stay. She looked at Andrew without blinking and told him to apologize. Her tone held Sunday dinner and hospital banquets and 1,000 small acts of management. Andrew's jaw clicked. He smiled instead of answering and let the laugh from 2 seats down wash over the moment like a napkin over a spill. I breathed in the citrus in the air and let it out through my teeth. I felt the watch face under my thumb and imagined my grandfather at his desk, a slant of afternoon light across a legal pad. Stand tall without pushing anyone down, he had written once. I lifted my water and drank. Father unfolded his napkin precisely and asked a resident about a new device that would change outcomes. The table obeyed, grateful for a safer conversation. The door eased open again. Kate had stepped out earlier to take a work call, her phone lighting her face in the hallway like a little moon. Now she returned, shoulders squared in a simple black dress, hair pinned in a way that said practicality before ornament. She looked down the table for her place, then up, and recognition moved across her face like dawn. She stopped 2 steps behind my chair, reflex tilting her into a small, respectful dip of the knees that would have been old-fashioned if it had not been so unconscious. Your Honor, she said before she could stop herself, I did not know you would be here. Silence folded over the table. A fork clinked against china from far away. I turned and met her eyes and let a small nod settle the air. Evening counsel. The word counsel did more damage than any raised voice. It drew a straight line from courtroom to table, from my robe to my last name. Heads moved a fraction, recalculating. Andrew's face drained in the lit room. He did not move. He looked at Kate, as if she had spoken in a language he did not know, and at me as if I had changed shape while he was not looking. Kate colored, then steadied. She slid into her chair with professional economy spine, tall hands composed on the table. I saw it then, the way she lived inside rules that had nothing to do with family pictures on mantels. The manager entered with the mains balanced along his forearm, and the ritual resumed because restaurants demand it. Plates landed with soft weight. Steam rose. The wedge of halibut glowed white under a sheen of butter. A lemon sat on mine like a coin. Mother kept her hand on mine for one more heartbeat, then drew back and reached for her water. Her knuckles looked thinner than they had last year. Father cleared his throat not to claim control this time, but as a man buying himself a second to decide whether to defy or obey a new arrangement of facts. He asked the anesthesiologist another question that had nothing to do with daughters or disgrace. Andrew stared at the rim of his wine. He swirled and watched the liquid climb and fall, then he tried a smile that did not reach his eyes. He told Kate it was a busy night and that everyone was tired. She did not answer. She cut a precise edge from her fish, lifted it, chewed, and looked at me. Respect sits easily on some faces. On hers it looked like home. I shifted the watch in my palm until the initials pressed into my skin. Butter pooled along the edge of my plate. My appetite did not make a case for itself. Across the table, a cousin whispered something to his wife and then pretended to be interested in the vegetables. The air seemed to thin and brighten. Or perhaps I had simply decided to breathe. I set my fork down and folded my napkin into a careful square. Then I lifted my water again and let it sit against my lower lip without drinking. The room had returned to talking, but the sound was a new species. It bent around that one sentence, "You are an embarrassment," and around Kate's reflex, "Your honor like current against a rock." I could feel the undertow, and I could feel the shoreline. I looked at Mother. She gave me a look I had not seen since childhood, when a scraped knee required both iodine and a popsicle. We would not fix anything in this room, not tonight. But a hinge had moved. You feel it when a door that has always stuck lifts a fraction on its pin. The table flowers were wilting at the edges, though the water was fresh. The manager asked if anyone wanted coffee after dinner. No one answered at first. Then someone said yes, just to prove we were fine. I lifted the lemon, squeezed it over what I would not eat, and let the bright scent cut through the butter. If the room wanted me small, I could still be steady. I placed the watch beneath the edge of my napkin where the initials kissed linen and waited for the next necessary thing. The next necessary thing arrived on the tip of my mother's voice. Elaine did not raise it. She simply told Andrew to apologize to his sister. The words were velvet with a wire inside. Andrew's eyes slid to Father and back to me. He said it had been a long week, and people say clumsy things when they are tired. He smiled, as if that could sweep up broken glass without cutting anyone. Kate watched him the way a good lawyer watches a witness who has just stepped on his own sentence. She set down her fork, folded her napkin, and faced him with quiet composure. She asked if he had told her that I had dropped out and vanished. She asked it gently, like a stitch pulled through fabric, and the room tugged around it. Conversation at the far end fell into coughs and small rearrangements of flatware. I kept my voice even and brief. I said I was appointed to the State Superior Court in 2020. The facts laid themselves on the tablecloth without flourishing. Mother breathed out a small sound that felt like the click of a lock. Andrew stared at the wine that had given him courage he had not earned. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said Kate must have misheard. He said our family had been through a lot and stories got tangled. He did not say I was wrong. He did not say he was sorry. He arranged his face in that familiar setting that had soothed donors and interns and guests at foundation galas. The setting did not work on Kate. Her left hand rose as if on its own string. She slid the ring from her finger with the same precise care she uses when lifting an exhibit before a judge. She turned Andrew's palm up and set the ring in it. Her voice did not tremble. She said she needed time. The words were not loud, but they were unmistakable. Someone down the table reached for a water glass and missed by an inch. Andrew's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked very young and very old at once. He started to say they could talk here now, and she shook her head once. Not here. Not like this. She shifted her napkin back into her lap, sat straighter, and picked up her fork. The manager passed with a pot of coffee. Steam ghosted the air and then drifted away. Mother released my hand and folded her own in her lap. She told Andrew again that an apology belonged here, not later, not over text, not with a bouquet sent in the morning. Andrew lifted his glass and did not drink. He said the moment had been blown out of proportion. He said everyone was making this bigger than it needed to be. He said time would smooth it. The room did not agree. It hummed with the particular silence of people learning something they will repeat in cars on the way home. When the check came, Father took it with automatic grace. He stacked his card on the small tray, straightened the receipt as if edges could restore order. He asked the manager to send our compliments to the kitchen. He pushed his chair back and stood. The table followed his lead out of habit. Outside on the sidewalk, the air tasted like hot stone and late summer basil from the planters along the curb. Boston traffic whispered and then hushed at the light. Mother touched my elbow and asked if I would drive her home. I said yes. We waited while Father and Andrew spoke to a colleague by the door. Kate stood a few feet away looking at the ring in Andrew's palm and then at the streetlights. She did not move toward him. She did not move toward me. She drew a breath, nodded once to the night, as if it were a clerk calling the next case, and walked to her car. In my sedan, the leather held the warmth of the day. Mother smoothed her skirt and stared at her hands. She said she had been following me for years. Not in a way that would embarrass me, she said, but in the way a mother who should have done better tries to make up for it in the quiet. She said she had cut out articles and printed interviews and watched live streams when she could. She said she had wanted hundreds of times to pick up the phone and then had put the phone down again. She said that was finished now. I turned onto Storrow and let the river keep pace with us. Mother watched the dark water and said I looked strong tonight. She said my grandfather would have been proud of how I did not swing back. She said she could not make Andrew apologize, but she could make sure I did not sit at a table alone again. The light at the ramp to Memorial Drive went green and I eased the car through it. At the curb in front of the house my parents still call home, Mother put her hand on the door handle and then left it there. She said we would have lunch next week, just us. She said she wanted to hear more about the cases where children end up with the parent who listens and not the parent who wins. She smiled at her own sentence, small and rueful. She opened the door and got out with more care than she used to. She told me to text when I was home. I said I would. Cambridge welcomed me with the soft grid of neighborhood lights and the whisper of bikes slipping past. I parked by the sycamore and walked up to the Craftsman that still smells like pipe tobacco on humid nights. Inside the front room, the old wood held its own kind of evening. I turned on a lamp with a brass pull that had gone smooth with decades of hands. On the table beside the couch, the grain ran like a riverbed under glass. I set the pocket watch down on that wood. The initials caught the light and then let it go. The house exhaled around me. I took off my shoes, undid the zipper of the green dress, and hung it where it would not crumple. In the kitchen, I poured a small glass of water and drank it standing by the sink. The window showed only my face and the outline of a tree. There are nights when the choice is to stew or to set a rule. I chose the rule. In the morning, I would make the calls I needed to make. I would document what needed to be documented. I would put in writing the line I had already drawn in my head. Professional transparency. No favors, no shadows. My grandfather's watch ticked once in my imagination and then settled. I turned off the lamp, let the room return to its quiet, and went upstairs to sleep with the door cracked for air. Morning came with a thin blue light, and the kind of quiet that tells you the day will ask for steadiness. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and Mother said they were on the way to Harborview. Her voice was careful. I dressed in a navy suit and flats that could carry me for hours, slid the pocket watch into my jacket, and drove through a city that had not decided yet if it would be hot. The hospital lobby smelled like coffee and antiseptic. I checked in at the desk and took the elevator up to cardiology. The doors opened to a corridor that knew the difference between hurry and panic. Andrew's colleague, David Chen, stood by the nurse's station and lifted a hand when he saw me. He said Father had had chest pain on the stairs and pressure, like a heavy book on the breastbone. He said they had given aspirin and oxygen and were running tests. He spoke in the same voice he used with families who needed facts laid out like clean linen. I followed him to a curtained bay. Andrew was already in motion. His face had gone still in the way it did when he worked. He asked for numbers, he listened to rhythms, he pressed down on tendons to see what lifted. He did not look at me. Father sat propped up, pale and irritated with his body. He told Andrew to stop hovering. Andrew kept hovering. A monitor blinked and gave us a steady march that felt like forgiveness. I stayed by the foot of the bed. I did not touch the chart or ask a question that did not belong to me. I nodded when a nurse introduced herself and stepped back when she needed the space I had taken. The curtain whispered, closed, and opened. The air had the sharp clean of disinfectant and the metallic tang of equipment that remembers its purpose. David read off the EKG and a list of markers. He said not a heart attack. He said angina and runs of irregular beats that had already calmed. He said medication and follow-up and less theater on the stairs. Father rolled his eyes at that and then looked past Andrew and found me. For a second, he looked like the man who had taught me to drive in an empty parking lot and laughed when I jerked the brake. He reached a hand out and I stepped in close enough to take it. His palm was warm and dry. He told me he had been wrong to push me into medicine. He said it is like a diagnosis spoken after tests have come back, and there is nothing to argue. The words landed like something solid on a shelf. I felt my own hand grip once around his, and then loosen. I said I heard him. It was not absolution, and it was not a wound. It was a place to put the next hour. Andrew finally looked up at me. He had meant to say something simple, but his face worked through whatever was behind his ribs, and he only managed honesty. He said he did not know how to be wrong. He put the chart down and stood very still, as if a breeze might knock him into the tray table. David asked about the dosage plan, and the moment jerked forward again. A woman in a slate suit walked in with a badge that announced administration and ethics. She introduced herself as Nora Patel, and she did not waste the room's attention. She asked Father how he felt and told him what would happen next, and then she asked Andrew if he would make time later in the week for a conversation about reporting protocols that had been more art than science. She said this like an invitation and not a subpoena. Andrew nodded before his brain could piece together what the question meant. Mother slipped in then, with her purse clutched under her elbow, eyes tracking the space for something she could do. She kissed Father's temple and stood beside me. A nurse came with a small cup of pills and a plastic water bottle. Father swallowed what he was told to swallow and grimaced at the aftertaste. He told Mother he would be fine by dinner, and she told him to save his energy for getting up the front steps. The cardiology fellow reviewed the plan again in a careful voice. New medication monitoring at home and appointment on Monday. No stairs until someone walked with him. No heroics. Father listened with the patience of a man who had given this speech to others and then signed his name at the bottom of their chart. He reached for the pen and signed his own discharge papers with a steadying breath. Andrew helped him ease into a wheelchair and thanked the nurse who adjusted the footrests. He remembered his manners because manners do not need you to be whole to be useful. He looked at me and I nodded. We understood the choreography. He would handle the medicine bag and the logistics with the front desk. I would walk with Mother to bring the car around. In the elevator, Mother stared at the glowing numbers and then at her shoes. She said, "Last night felt like a theater where someone pulled back the curtain too fast." She said today felt like an empty stage waiting for the crew to reset everything in the dark. I told her we could do the quiet work while the lights were down. She squeezed my hand once. We rolled Father to the entrance where the sidewalk holds taxis and impatience. Andrew urged the chair over a seam in the concrete, and Father pretended it did not jolt. David said he would call in the evening to check on him and clapped Andrew on the shoulder. Dr. Patel passed us again on her way to a meeting and gave Andrew a nod that was both professional and personal. The sky was a clean blue that made the glass of the hospital shine. I opened the passenger door, and Mother steadied Father while he lowered himself into the seat. Andrew put the small bag of medication in the side pocket and closed the door with care. No one said much. The quiet had weight, but it did not crush. We left the curb and merged into traffic. and the city opened ahead with all its lanes and all its lights, and we did not hurry. I dropped Mother and Father at the house and watched Andrew carry the pharmacy bag inside. Then I turned the wheel toward the courthouse. Noon light bounced off Charles, and the city looked scrubbed clean. By the time I stepped into chambers, the clock on the wall had just slipped past 12. Diana Park had already laid out the calendar like a map color, tabs all in their lanes. She looked up with the steady competence that has carried me through too many crowded dockets to count, and asked what I needed. We started with the week ahead. I read each caption and underlined what would move and what would hold. The names passed like street signs, and then we came to the one that mattered. Monroe Community Legal Services did not appear anywhere on my calendar, and yet I felt the tug of it even in its absence. I told Diana we would memorialize a permanent recusal regarding Kate Monroe and any entity she leads or represents, and any case that presents a reasonable question about our connection. We opened the template that sits in the shared drive for conflict notices, and I began to write. The words were simple. I documented the circumstance that created a personal relationship, the date, the scope of the recusal, and the instruction that any matter assigned to me involving Ms. Monroe or MCLS would be reassigned by the clerk of court without review. I cited the Code of Conduct for United States judges. No embellishment, no apology. Clarity lives in black and white. Diana read it with lips moving just enough to catch errors, then caught two and fixed them. She printed 3 copies and handed me a pen. I signed until my name looked foreign, and then signed again where the stamp asked for it. Diana scanned the notice, uploaded it to the docket, routed a copy to the clerk of court, and placed a hard copy in the public folder in the lobby, where people come for information they do not want to ask a clerk to say out loud. She is quick with hands and careful with steps. When she finished, she looked up, and the set of her mouth told me the hinge had moved. She asked if there would be a statement. I said we would post a short notice on the court website that directs to the docket entry. She nodded and drafted 2 sentences that said exactly that. I read them and approved without changing a thing. The phone on my desk sat like a stone. I picked it up anyway and called Kate. She answered on the second ring. I told her that for the sake of the court and for the sake of us as professionals, I had entered a permanent recusal and that all communication from this point about any active or potential case would stay in public channels. She listened without interruption and agreed in the same measured voice she uses in motions court. We did not walk on the old ground. We did not even mention last night. We stated the boundary and we let it stand. When I hung up, my cell buzzed on the corner of the desk. Maya Torres had sent 2 words. Good call. I let myself smile at the economy. Then I set the phone face down and asked Diana to block 30 minutes for me. She knows what that means. She stacked what could wait on the right and what could not on the left, and left me with a neat desk and the sound of the hallway. I changed into running shoes I keep under the coat rack and walked down Beacon to the water, then across the Longfellow where the railings throw shadows like piano keys. The bridge rose under me with the little huff of a grade, and the river shoulder to shoulder with Boston. My lungs took in air that tasted like metal and sun, and the steady pound of my feet made room in my head. I did not think of words. I let the rhythm write over everything for a few minutes. On the Cambridge side, I stopped and pressed my palms against the cool stone, then turned back. Small boats stitched the river with pale wakes. A pair of students laughed like they had borrowed the day from someone else. Back in chambers, I washed my face, put the flats back on, and sat. The notice was live on the docket. The website held the link. The public folder had the paper in the front slot. I sent a brief internal email to the other judges and to the clerk of court, so no one would be surprised when a reassignment request came through. Diana replied with a thumb-up emoji that the email client translated into a small square with a word in it. It made me laugh more than it should have, and it also broke the last edge of strain behind my eyes. I checked the afternoon list and took a sip of water. The first counsel of the T2 o'clock matter had already arrived and was speaking softly to a client by the window, a father who kept smoothing the collar of his shirt. I looked at him and thought about last night and this morning and the rule I had set for myself. Professional transparency. No favors. No shadows. The pen sat ready. The door to the courtroom was open, and the bench a quiet line waiting for a voice. I stood straight in my jacket and let my hand brush the pocket where the watch rested, then walked toward the work that would keep me honest. Autumn leaned over Boston with that first clean chill that makes people stand a little straighter. My docket thickened as families tried to finish things before the holidays, and the trees along the Charles began to trade green for rust. In the middle of a Tuesday, Diana slid a stack of notices to my elbow. On top sat a public flyer from the planning department. It announced a community meeting on a proposed North Beacon redevelopment in a neighborhood where the Riverside Community Center had lived for decades. I read the time and place and set it on the corner of my desk like something that should never get lost under other paper. That afternoon, Monroe Community Legal Services posted a public notice on its site. The language was measured. The group would represent Riverside Community Center in city proceedings related to the redevelopment. There was a link to the planning agenda and a request for neighbors to attend. It was information anyone could see. It also made the line I had drawn last month glow like a fresh stripe of paint. I forwarded the notice to Diana without comment, and she archived it in the file marked Recusal References. That evening, Mother called while water hissed into my kettle. She had heard the city was looking again at that riverfront parcel. She reminded me that the Whitaker Foundation had signed a research memorandum a year back to study health outcomes if a clinic were added in any housing built there. She did not like how that sounded now that the community center had counsel. She said optics as if the word itself had teeth. I told her to speak with Foundation Counsel and to ask for a written plan that separated philanthropy from any development talks. I kept my voice careful. I did not offer advice beyond the kind a daughter can give without straying into anyone's case. She said she would do that in the morning. I poured the boiling water and watched steam turn the window into a pale square. On the night of the planning session, I went as a citizen and stood in the back near a mural that had been painted by children 15 summers ago. The room smelled like coffee and poster paint and the faint old sawdust of a gym floor. Neighbors filled folding chairs. A man I later learned was Samuel Ortiz, welcomed people and asked them to sign a sheet so the city would know who had been counted. I saw Kate across the room, a simple blazer hair pulled back, a notebook open in her hands. When it was her turn, she stepped to the microphone and spoke in the cadence I knew from motions hearings. She addressed traffic and displacement and after-school programs and the way a neighborhood changes when a trusted door closes. Her voice stayed calm even when someone in the back scoffed about progress. I slipped out before the press began to cluster by the exit. The night air smelled like rain that might not arrive. Weeks passed. Leaves loosened and pattered down to the sidewalks. I heard nothing more than any other resident would hear, which is to say the particular music of a city gearing up for a fight. Then a Boston Ledger alert flashed across my phone while I was reading briefs at my kitchen table. The paper had run a long investigation. It was built on planning minutes and emails obtained through a public records request. In the middle of the second piece sat a document the Ledger called an alignment memo. It described meetings between North Beacon Development and a unit associated with the Hospital Foundation, and it spoke of mutual visibility and coordinated messaging around the benefits of redevelopment. Nothing about it announced a crime. Everything about it announced a problem of appearances. The comments under the article lit like brush. Neighbors argued with consultants. Alumni from the community center posted photos from long-ago field trips. A morning radio host asked pointed questions between weather and traffic. The foundation released a statement that said it engaged in research to improve health and that it would install additional guardrails to avoid any confusion about its role. North Beacon said the memo was an early draft and that it welcomed community voices. The planning department put 2 more meetings on the calendar to absorb what the city had learned from its own records. I said nothing. I did what judges do when the air gets loud. I read the public documents to understand what any reader could understand. Then I put them away. I did not forward links. I did not call Mother back with ideas. I did not text Kate so that any message could be mistaken for a signal. Diana asked at the door if I wanted her to prepare a short internal note for Chambers reminding staff that we had no docketed matters on the project and would decline to discuss any hypothetical. I said yes. She sent a clean sentence that shut every switch I could think of. At dinner the next night, Father folded the ledger open and frowned at a paragraph describing the research unit attached to the foundation. He said the article made everyone look like amateurs. Mother told him she had spoken to counsel that morning and that a separation plan was already in motion. Andrew arrived late, hair damp from a scrub, and that tight line between his brows that used to mean exams. No one said Kate's name. We ate roast chicken and carrots that tasted like earth and silence. When Mother lifted the coffee pot, Father covered his cup with his palm and shook his head. In Chambers the following morning, I watched a clip from the city website that recapped the meeting for residents who could not attend. Samuel stood at the front with a poster that showed children reading on a rug. A developer's representative pointed at a diagram of mixed-use blocks. A woman in a red sweater held her ground at the microphone while she described her mother's ride to dialysis and how the center had kept her grandchildren fed when a paycheck fell apart. The clip ended with a list of the next dates where the public could be heard again. I closed the browser and let the screen go dark. The pocket watch lay in the drawer to my right, not as a talisman this time, but as a reminder that time chooses whether we are patient or we are sloppy. The city would keep speaking in minutes and memos. My job was to keep my silence clean and my work clear. Outside my window, the first real wind of fall moved through the trees and shook loose a dozen leaves that spun once and then laid themselves down. By midweek, the air had that metallic bite that tells you the first frost is rehearsing off stage. Andrew texted early and asked if I could meet him by the coffee stand under the Sky Bridge. I walked over on my lunch break from Chambers past the volunteer desk where a man in a knitted vest handed out directions like small blessings. Andrew was already waiting, hands in the pockets of his coat, jaw tight, in the way that means he has slept and not rested. He said Dr. Patel had opened a review of the complication reporting process. He said the committee wanted timelines and numbers and a clean path from the moment something goes wrong to the moment it is recorded and addressed. He looked at the floor while he said it, then looked at me and admitted he kept thinking about what would happen to Father if the hospital had to face hard facts. I reminded him that ethics is not a personal insult. I told him to follow the rules that protect patients and to write what was true and only what was true. He nodded like a man standing at the edge of a pool who already knows he will jump. We walked the long corridor where the glass throws the city back at you. Andrew said he had pulled the relevant sections of the CMS conditions of participation and the HIPAA privacy rules, and he had opened a blank document because there is mercy in a new page. He said a senior attending had suggested speaking to Father first so that he did not have to be surprised. Andrew shook his head when he repeated it and said he could not do that. If a committee is to work, it cannot be pre-edited by the people it regulates. He peeled off toward an office suite where the glass doors carry the understated sign for hospital ethics and review. I waited on a bench with a view of a potted ficus and a bulletin board with a flyer about mindfulness on Thursdays. Nurses walked by in pairs, their shoes making a light sound against the floor. A resident laughed too loudly at something on his phone and then caught himself, eyes flicking to a family seated nearby. The world knows how to be gentle when it remembers. An hour later, Andrew came out with a stack of printouts and a copy of his report. His face was a shade lighter, as if the blood had learned something. He said he had laid out dates and case numbers without adjectives, and he had proposed a revision of the internal policy so that delayed entries could not hide inside the softness of busy days. In the middle of drafting, he had sent a copy to Laura Benton in legal for a compliance check. She had called him and suggested careful phrasing. He told her he would keep the language plain and factual. She reminded him that words have temperature. He agreed and kept them cool but not vague. In the hallway outside the office, a colleague stopped him and said he could talk to Father if that would help. Andrew thanked him and said, "Help looks different right now." He did not ask anyone to soften the landing. He walked with me to the end of the corridor and then turned back to make one last notation at the nurse's station, so the paper trail matched the day he had just lived. That afternoon, the intranet carried a short notice from the Ethics Committee. It announced the review and said the hospital would publish its recommendations at the end of the process so that staff and patients would understand the changes. The language was calm and formal. I read it from my desk and felt something in my shoulders leave. It is a rare gift when an institution says it will let light in. Mother and I met the next day for a quick lunch at a small place across from the hospital, with tomato soup that stains the rim of the bowl and grilled cheese that understands how adulthood craves childhood. She listened while I explained in general terms what a review means and how it is not a trial and not an insult, just a way to make the floor stronger where people have slipped. She folded her napkin and said, "If the truth hurts, then better early so it can heal sooner." She smiled at the spoon as if it had helped. Later that week, I saw Father on the landing outside his office, leaning against the rail and reading the city edition of the Ledger. We did not mention the article or the memo or the committee. He looked at me and then looked at the big clock that runs the day for people who need to speak softly. His mouth pressed into a line that was not anger and not surrender. It was a line that says, "I have heard what I did not want to hear, and I will sit with it." He did not try to claim the next move. That mattered more than he knew. Andrew sent a text that evening to say the first follow-up session had been scheduled and that he would bring a chart showing how other centers do it when they do it right. He did not ask me to read it. He did not ask me to advise. He only said the work would be done and that he would see it through. I turned off my phone and stood at the window and watched the last of the leaves let go and skitter along the street in small, bright clumps. The city had settled into its fall voice. Inside the house, the old wood in the stair banister felt warm under my palm. I went upstairs to my desk and wrote 3 sentences in my journal to remember the day that my brother chose the harder version of brave. The week tilted toward late fall when the envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was a filed petition from my cousin Abigail and my uncle Thomas, asking the probate court to divide the house on Maple Street. The words sat prim and sharp on the page. They wanted a share of a place that had held my breath steady for 5 long years. I read it twice and then called an attorney who does nothing but probate work. Her name is Alice Grant, and she has the voice of someone who clears paths with a broom instead of a bulldozer. Alice met me in her office where the carpets had survived a decade of worried clients. She asked for the will, the deed, the dates, and anything that would help a judge see what my grandfather meant. I handed her the letter I had kept in a waterproof sleeve. March of 2018. My grandfather's hand was steady but softened at the edges. Integrity over legacy. Build your own life here. Alice read it and nodded once. Then she told me a letter is not a codicil, but a court can consider it to explain a clause if the will needs light. She promised to look for anything in the family files that would support the handwriting. 2 days later, Alice found an old affidavit from our family attorney, a man who had since passed. He had handled my grandfather's affairs and had sworn in 2018 that the letter was in Edward J. Whitaker's hand. The affidavit had been notarized and filed with a set of personal papers that had gone to storage. Alice called the clerk and had a certified copy sent to her office. When she handed it to me, I felt the small lift that happens when the road ahead gets one orange cone moved off to the side. On a gray morning, we walked into the Middlesex Probate and Family Court. The hallway smelled like wet wool and old paper. Abigail sat with a real estate agent and tried not to look at me. Thomas spoke in low tones to a lawyer who had chosen a tie that announced confidence with a little too much enthusiasm. Alice placed our folder on the counsel table and lined up her pen with its cap like a girl who respects a ritual. I kept the watch in my pocket and my back against the chair. I am no one in this courtroom except a party who will let her lawyer speak. The judge read the file as if the paper itself could tell the truth if handled properly. Abigail's counsel argued that my grandfather had favored both sides of the family and that carving off an interest was fair. He used the phrase undue influence and let it hang in the air like perfume. Alice stood and marked a timeline. She showed the dates when my grandfather wrote the letter, when he met with his attorney, when he signed the will that left the house to me. She noted that he died months later, never amending the will, and that no one had raised a question while he was alive and sharp. She handed up the affidavit about the handwriting. She did it without drama and with the confidence of a woman who knows how much noise is too much. The judge asked questions that I would have asked. What exactly in the will needs explanation? What weight to give to a letter that is personal but specific? Whether anyone could testify about conversations near that time. Alice described a visit I had made with my grandfather to the house 2 weeks after the letter was written. She had found a note in the old attorney's file about that day. It recorded that my grandfather wanted to make sure I kept the house as a place to stand that was mine and not the family's. The judge read the note and set it down carefully. When it was my turn to speak as a witness, Alice kept it brief. She asked me to confirm that the letter had been kept since 2018 and that I had not asked my grandfather to write it. I told the truth, which sits cleaner when it is not stretched. The opposing counsel tried again with undue influence. He asked about family dinners and gifts and pressure. Alice objected at the places where questions grew into stories. The judge sustained enough times to send a message. There is a sound to a courtroom at ease with its own spine. You hear it in the way people stop fidgeting. Then the judge announced what the court would do. The will would be admitted without change. The letter would be accepted as extrinsic evidence that helps explain the intention behind the device of the house. The court would take the matter under advisement and issue a decision on a date already written in a small square on the clerk's calendar. The judge also noted the absence of credible evidence of undue influence. That is as close to a nod as a bench will ever give you before it is ready to sign. Outside, the air had a wet edge as if snow were thinking about us. Alice tucked the certified copies back in the folder and told me to go home and breathe. She said the scale was tilting the right way so long as we did not push. I thanked her and walked to the car with the kind of care that follows a morning of careful words. At the house, I stood on the porch, where the paint needs a spring afternoon and a steady brush. The door felt warm even in the cold, because a door remembers the hands that have touched it. I took the watch from my pocket and closed my fingers around it until the initials pressed a small truth into my skin. Stand tall without pushing anyone down. I said it in my head so it would lodge. Across the street, a neighbor's dog decided whether to bark and then did not. A single leaf lost its grip and floated down into the hedges. The day held steady. I let it go. Cold settled into the boards of the porch and into the hinge of the front door. Winter had arrived with a thin gray sky and the scrape of salt trucks at dawn. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Diana. She had screens from a neighborhood Facebook group for Beacon Ridge HOA. The post said Judge Whitaker favors her brother's fiancée. The comments unspooled fast. A few neighbors piled on. Someone suggested writing the chief judge. Someone dug up an old photo of me at a community event and treated it like evidence. Diana added that 3 people had sent her messages with accusations, and one had included a threat to report her to the bar that she did not belong to. She ended with a line that was pure steadiness. She said she was fine, but wanted me to know. I set the phone on the counter and put my hands flat beside it. Anger is a spark. You can cup it for warmth or burn your sleeve. I texted Maya and asked if she had 10 minutes. She called back in 2. I told her the shape of the situation, and she said we would do the thing that always works. We would put the facts in a short note, and we would ask for a correction. No threats, no performance, only links. I pulled up the docket entry for my recusal. Diana had placed a copy in the public folder weeks ago, and the clerk had posted the index number on the website. I found the court policy on case assignment that explains how matters are randomly assigned and reassigned when a recusal is filed. Maya drafted a 1-page request to the group administrator. The language was polite and direct. It said the post contained a false assertion about favoritism. It said the judge had permanently recused from any case involving Ms. Monroe or Monroe Community Legal Services and had documented that step publicly. It linked to the docket and to the policy. It asked for a removal and a correction so that members would not be misled. It asked that any harassment of staff stop. I read the draft and took out any flourish that might feel like a threat. Massachusetts has strong protections for speech in public forums. I was not going to hand anyone a reason to shift the story to rights instead of facts. We copied the HOA board email listed on the group page and added the court public information officer so no one would wonder later if we had said one thing in private and another in public. Then I pressed send and felt the old house breathe around me. An hour passed with no response. I answered 2 calls on routine matters and signed 1 order. Snow began to flurry past the front window, small and undecided. Then an email arrived from a person named Lydia Kramer who identified herself as the Beacon Ridge HOA administrator. She said she would review the links and get back to us. 10 minutes later, she wrote again. She said the post would come down and a correction would go up. She apologized for the messages to my staff and asked me to forward any further harassment so she could address it with the group rules. I opened the group on my phone and saw that the original post had vanished. In its place sat a new one from the administrator. It said the earlier thread was removed for misinformation. It said the court had confirmed a permanent recusal by Judge Whitaker regarding Ms. Monroe and her organization, and that case assignment is handled by the clerk according to written policy. It discouraged personal attacks and reminded members that disagreements about policy do not require attacks on people. Comments were turned off. I took a breath that reached the bottom of my lungs for the first time that day. Diana texted a few minutes later. She had received a direct apology from Lydia for the messages and a note that any further harassment would result in a suspension from the group. Diana ended her text with a small bit of humor about never thinking her inbox would be the place where democratic norms needed protecting. I told her thank you for holding the line and for forwarding the apology to the court email for the file. Mother called in the afternoon and said a neighbor had stopped her by the mailbox to ask if everything was all right. Mother told her that our family was learning to use our inside voices out in the world. I sat at my kitchen table and let that image soften the corners of the day. Then I drafted a 3-sentence internal memo for Chambers. It noted the correction and asked staff to continue to refer any inquiries to the public links and to avoid any discussion beyond what is posted. Diana replied that the memo was posted and that she would screen messages for anything that required a response. Before dusk, I walked the block. The air held the clean smell of snow that had not decided to stick. Lights came on one by one in windows where families set tables and reheated soup. A boy dragged a plastic sled over grass that did not need it and laughed anyway. The watch in my pocket felt heavier in the cold. I thought about how fast a rumor travels and how small a truth can look beside it until you hold it up to light. At home, I wrote a single line on a yellow pad and propped it under the lamp. Transparency is not to win. It is so people who have never met you can still trust what you do. The room was quiet and the night gathered itself against the glass. I let the thought sit there and do its work. Morning iced the edges of windows and turned breath into small clouds outside the courthouse. Judge Harriet Sloan called me to Chambers before my first calendar. Her robe hung on the back of a chair, the fabric soft with years, and her hands smoothed it as if telling it the news. She was retiring at the turn of the year. She said it in the firm way a pilot says we will encounter some weather and keep going. Then she lifted her eyes to mine and told me to apply to the District of Massachusetts merit selection for magistrate judge. She said the court needed people who cut through performance and reached the marrow. She said I had been building toward this since the day I stepped into her courtroom as a new clerk with a pen and a good coat. In the afternoon, I called Richard Cole and asked if he would write a letter. He laughed the way old trial lawyers do when they are pleased and pretending not to be. The letter landed in my inbox the next morning, crisp and spare. It spoke of work rather than adjectives. Diana printed 3 copies and placed them with my application packet. I read the forms until they blurred, then went for a walk around the block to remind my legs what their job is. The panel sat 2 weeks later in a conference room that smelled like clean carpet and cautious coffee. 7 people behind a long table and a court reporter in the corner. A flag in the stand by the window. I wore a navy suit that could carry good news or bad without wrinkling. Marcus Reed from our courthouse greeted me in the hallway with a nod that grounded my feet, and then stepped back so I could breathe. They began with history. Why law? Why judge I spoke of families who need steadiness more than thunder? Of a clerkship where Judge Sloan taught me the mercy of a clear record. Of years in a firm where the best compliment was that a brief read like, "There was no author, only the law." I describe my approach from the bench. Keep hearing short and honest. Ask the question everyone is skirting. Push counsel to meet facts with law, and leave the theater outside. One panelist leaned forward and asked about the equalizer nickname. I did not flinch. I said it came from courthouse staff because I cut through posturing and do not confuse volume with merit. I said my job is to bring both sides to the same floor and then measure. Another asked about temperament. I told them calm is a decision and a muscle. You strengthen it by using it when you would rather run hot. We turned to conflicts. The chair asked about Cape Monroe and Monroe Community Legal Services. I answered the way I had planned to answer since the day I signed the notice. I said I had entered a permanent recusal regarding Ms. Monroe and any entity she leads or represents, that the notice sits on the docket and on the court website, and that any matter is reassigned by the clerk without review. I said that all communication about any case would remain in public channels. I did not wander. I did not soften the edges. A panel member smiled in a way that reached the eyes and called my answer refreshingly candid. I let that sit and did not gild it. They asked about the city controversy they had read in the paper. I said I had followed it as any citizen can by reading public records, and that the only thing I had done was to keep my own boundaries bright and my docket clean. They asked about sentence variety, because even formal hearings have a human undertow. I said clear mission sentences for orders, careful listening for testimony, and a willingness to say, I do not know when I do not. The court reporter looked up and back down, and I liked that tiny sign that I had not put her to sleep. At the end, the chair asked if I had anything to add. I thought of Judge Sloan lifting the edge of her old robe and the way fabric remembers the hands that have carried it. I told the panel that judging is not authority to me. It is a service bound by rules on purpose. It is stable in rooms where other kinds of storms are already blowing. It is the promise that the same process will meet you whether you are loud or quiet, or well-dressed or not sure where to sit. They thanked me and stood. Chairs scraped lightly across the carpet. Marcus was waiting by the elevator. He took my hand in both of his and squeezed once. No words. We both looked at the seal on the wall and let the air move. Back at the chambers, I set my application packet in the bottom drawer and placed the pocket watch on top of it for a minute, as if letting one anchor meet another. I turned to the docket and finished the afternoon work. At 5, Diana poked her head in and said I had an email. The subject line was crisp. The panel thanked me for my time and moved my file to the next stage. I read it twice and then once more out loud in my head. Outside, the streetlights came on, one by one, in the early dark of December. I closed the drawer and sat in the quiet, and let myself feel the lift without letting go of the ground. Snow that could not make up its mind drifted past the windows of City Hall and melted before it touched anything. The atrium smelled like coffee and wool coats. I took a place along the wall near a bulletin board layered with notices for free tax prep and food pantry hours. I had come as a citizen, and I kept my hands in my pockets so I would not forget it. Over the last month, Monroe Community Legal Services had filed a complaint in Suffolk Superior Court against North Beacon Development. The docket number had made its quiet home on the state site. Since then, there had been a corridor of closed-door meetings that did not belong to me. The public part would happen here, and the court part would happen across town in a clerk's queue where paper becomes orders when the language is ready. The planning hearing began with a review of the project map, blocks and setbacks, and the way light falls between new buildings. The Riverside Community Center sat on the page like an old friend at the end of the row. When it was time for the community to speak, Samuel Ortiz walked to the microphone with a poster board in his hands. He talked about children who learn to read on a carpet that has seen better days, about seniors who find their balance in a room with scuffed baseboards, about the way a neighborhood breathes when a door stays open. He had a list of after-school programs that sounded like small lifelines. He read them the way you read names. Kate spoke next for MCLS. She was precise and calm. She laid out the legal path that had brought them to both rooms at once. Here for policy, there for law. She talked about displacement that does not announce itself, but arrives one lease at a time. She talked about traffic and bus lines and grocery runs that double back when a route is cut. She did not threaten. She did not posture. She asked for a future that did not erase what worked. When the developer representative spoke, he used a vocabulary that fills binders. Mixed income, activation, live work. He said there was a willingness to listen and to adjust. He said partnership more than once. The city planner thanked everyone for showing up and posted the next steps on a screen. The hearing ended without a bow. People stood and collected their coats and carried their opinions down the stairs. In the rotunda, a press conference formed with the gravity of habit. A podium microphones the small shuffle of camera operators finding a line of sight. I stood behind a column with 3 other women and a teenage boy who held his grandmother's purse while she balanced on her cane. The city communications officer introduced a sequence of speakers. First Kate, then Samuel, then the chief executive of North Beacon, who had the posture of a man who flies too often and rarely looks out the window, then Laura Benton from the hospital and foundation side. Kate explained that after extensive negotiation, the parties had reached terms that would be filed that afternoon in Suffolk Superior Court as a consent judgment. The city would also record a development agreement that reflected those terms. She outlined the pieces in language ordinary people could carry home. 25% of the units would be affordable under the city incentive program. A fund would be created for 10 years to support after-school programming in the neighborhood. Riverside Community Center would be preserved and renovated in place. Monitoring and reporting would be public. Samuel read a short list of programs that would be supported by the fund. Homework help, and a music room, and a cooking class where kids learn to turn a bag of groceries into dinners. His voice warmed the cold marble. A woman behind me pressed a tissue to her eyes and whispered that she had taught her grandson to measure sugar for cornbread in that kitchen. The chief executive of North Beacon, Glenn Radford, stepped up next. He said the company wanted to build well and build with neighbors at the table. He said the consent judgment would bring certainty that allowed lenders to breathe. He signed his name at the bottom of the summary sheet in a careful hand that looked like it belonged to an engineer rather than a salesman. Laura Benton spoke for the hospital and the foundation. She said the research unit would step aside from any development discussions and that new conflict guardrails would go into place immediately. She described a separation plan that drew bright lines between philanthropy and real estate so that no one would read intention into proximity again. She looked out at the crowd and held a pause long enough for the words to land. The city attorney lifted a folder and said the settlement papers were being e-filed at that moment with Suffolk Superior Court. There was a small murmur as if a door had clicked shut on a draft. Reporters asked their questions in the orderly way Boston manages a scrum. People around me exhaled in a way that made shoulders drop and mouths soften. No one cheered. It felt more like a collective decision to unclench. I did not stay for the photos. I walked out into the thin winter light and watched a line form at the food truck for soup that smells like garlic and green things. I bought a small cup and stood on the steps with my glove off so I would not spill. Across the plaza, a child in a red hat did a running slide along a strip of slush and laughed. I sent Mother a simple text that said the city had announced a path and that the court would have its copy by afternoon. She sent back a heart, and the words proud of the work, even when it is not yours. I let myself accept that. By evening, the ledger had the story on the homepage. The headlines were steady: settlement filed, center preserved, affordable units increased, foundation adds, conflict safeguards. I shut the laptop and stood by the window. The watch in my pocket felt cool against my palm. I thought of rooms where papers had slid across tables and voices had not risen, and of the way a clean process makes clean outcomes feel possible. Then I turned off the light and let the day be finished. March arrived with a thin sun and a letter embossed with a seal that made my hands steadier just to hold it. The district judges had appointed me as a United States magistrate judge. The oath fit into a small ceremony in the old courtroom with high windows and wood that remembers. The chief judge raised his hand, and I did the same. Judge Sloan stood at the aisle with a smile that looked like pride and relief braided together. Marcus Reed took his place near the door and gave me the quiet nod that has anchored 100 mornings. Mother sat in the second row and kept her hands folded tight in her lap. Father came and watched the proceedings like a man learning a new instrument. When it was done, I received a black robe that felt heavier at the shoulders in a way that made sense. The first week in the new role tasted like strong coffee and policy manuals. I learned the rhythm of arraignments at 9 and settlement conferences that move in careful inches. Diana kept my calendar stitched tight, and my recusal remained bright on the docket where anyone could see it. I went home every night feeling kind of tired. In April, Andrew sent a message that was half decision and half plea. He had applied to work with Doctors Without Borders for a short-term surgical assignment, and he had been accepted. He said he wanted to stand where skill mattered more than title and where equipment had to be coaxed rather than ordered. I met him by the hospital entrance on a morning that still needed gloves. He looked lean with resolve. He asked if this was running away. I told him it was running toward a kind of clarity and that sometimes the fastest way back to yourself is the long way. He sent notes when the connection allowed. A clinic in a heat that never sleeps. A light that blinked during a procedure and hands that moved anyway. He learned the weight of gauze when there is not enough and the beauty of a suction tube repaired with tape. His words shed the lacquer of presentation. He said the work was humbling and right-sized. He said patience had a way of blessing you without teaching you lessons. I read his messages after long days and felt something careful healing between us. At home, Father began to step back from the committees that had dressed his calendar for years. He met with Dr. Patel and said he would take the ethics seminar for the residents in the fall. He asked her for reading lists as if he were the one starting out. I sat in the back of the first session and watched him frame a problem without the old sharpness. He said disclosure early is medicine. He said mistakes require a language that does not hide. June carried Andrew home thinner in the face and clearer in the eyes. He sat at my kitchen table and drank iced tea like it was a miracle. He said he wanted to build something for places that did not have everything. A research track that would design low-cost surgical tools for hospitals that run more on grit than on grants. He laughed once and said that younger Andrew would have called this second tier. He said the Andrew who had watched a child recover without the machine he could not get had no use for tears. He told Father the same in an office that had framed diplomas and a window with a stubborn blind. Father listened and then surprised both of us by saying that purpose outranks prestige when the lights go out. Summer loosened its grip and fall found us at a long table in Concord. The windows held maples turning like slow fire. The roast rested on a board, and someone had brought a pie that leaked a little sugar at the edge. Conversation moved without the small landmines we had learned to look for. In the quiet after the plates had been cleared, Mother placed her hands on the table as if preparing to lift it. She said she had something to put into the room and she did not want to put it there alone. She told us that the previous October she had given a seed donation to help Monroe Community Legal Services get off the ground. She said she had done it because she had spent years quiet when she should have spoken, and that a gift was not a confession, but it was a way of climbing off the fence. The table held its breath and then let it out. I thanked her. I told her that I was proud of the impulse, and I asked that the gift be listed in the organization's annual report by name so no one would build a story in the shadows. She took that in and nodded with a small relief that made her look younger. She said she would ask the director to include it in the next public filing, and that she would sign whatever letter would make that clear. Andrew cleared his throat and said he had reached out to Kate. He had met her at a cafe with soft chairs and coffee that knows its job. He told her he had dressed himself in success and then used that to make other people smaller. He said he had told her that what he called protecting was really hiding. He said she had listened without giving away more than she chose to, and that they had parted with respect and no plan to try again. He added that the research group had given him space to design a kit of instruments that could be fabricated locally for a fraction of what a catalog would charge. He said he would need help finding rural hospitals for the pilot, and Father said he knew a doctor in Maine who had been making do for 30 years. We did not make speeches. We did something smaller and therefore more durable. We agreed that our table would have rules. No humiliations. Tell the truth. Own what is yours. Mother wrote them on an index card and tucked it under the salt. The card sat there like a quiet promise. When the evening broke up, I walked to the porch alone for a minute. The Concord air carried wood smoke and the sweet tiredness of a long, good day. The watch sat cool in my pocket. Inside plates clinked, and someone laughed softly and no one raised a voice to win. I stood at the rail and let the dark settle without asking it for anything more. September laid a bright coin on Boston. The mornings were cool and the afternoons warm enough to forgive you for forgetting a jacket. I walked into the federal courthouse as the security guard clicked on his light for the bin of laptops. The robe felt heavier than the one I had worn before, in a way that made me hold my shoulders right. The calendar on my desk carried its usual mix of arraignments and conferences. A sticky note from Diana sat at the corner. A reminder that the compliance hearing for North Beacon would be on the afternoon list for Judge Morales. I wrote a small check mark and put the note in the file. The case did not belong to me and would not pass my door. An hour later, the clerk pinged my screen with a reassignment form. A new filing had landed with Monroe Community Legal Services in the caption. The system had already rerouted it to another magistrate according to the recusal notice. I initiated the acknowledgement and smiled at the quiet competence of a process that does not ask you to be noble. It just asks you to be consistent. In the hallway after a motion calendar, I saw Kate coming out of courtroom 3. She held a slim folder and a face that a win gives you when you have earned it and kept your voice low. The hallway slowed, as if respectful of something larger than itself. We stepped to the side so a family could pass and nodded to each other. She said good afternoon in the even tone we keep for our work home. I said congratulations and left it there. Professional respect fits without being stitched. Father started his ethics seminar for the residents in the small lecture room that used to be a storage closet. I sat in the back row and watched him move through case studies with a slower hand than he used to. He put my opinion from a state case on the screen. He read the part where I had written that transparency is not punishment and not theater. It is a light for both the person who needs to admit and the person who needs to trust. He looked at the room and said I was wrong when I chose pressure over patience. You can feel a room shift when an elder lowers his guard. The resident stopped writing for a second and just looked at him. He nodded once as if to mark the moment and then went back to the slide about reporting timelines. Andrew asked me to come to a small presentation he gave at the hospital auditorium. He wore a suit that looked like it had been bought for someone who now prefers a work shirt. He talked about a kit of surgical tools that could be made locally for a fraction of the catalog price. He described clamps designed to be sterilized in simple units, lighting rigs patched from parts you can find in a hardware store suction that runs on portable power when the grid gives up. He told a story about a boy and a generator that failed, and the way a whole team learned to move under a different kind of clock. He did not sell anything. He offered a plan. Father sat 3 rows back and asked questions that helped instead of pinned. When they shook hands afterward, I saw something pass between them that did not involve hierarchy. On a quiet Friday, I finished an opinion in a dispute that had been trying to out-talk itself. I printed a copy to proof on paper, because paper shows you where you lean too hard. The sentences looked like they could stand. I slid the opinion into a folder for mailing and put another copy in my bag. Late afternoon light made the city streets look honest. I drove out to Concord, where the grass always seems to organize itself. The cemetery was empty except for a groundskeeper trimming back a rose bush that had ideas beyond its border. I walked to my grandfather's stone and stood there long enough for my heart to quiet. I set the new opinion on the flat top of the marker and pressed my palm against it as if to affix a seal. The words had to do with neighbors and offense and the dignity of getting to be wrong without being ruined. I thought he would have liked that. I took the watch from my pocket. EJW in the soft gold. I closed my fingers around it the way I had in rooms where no one clapped. The air smelled like leaves that were only thinking about turning. On the drive back, the radio offered a song I used to play when I was studying for the bar. I let it run and felt the past and the present sit side by side without bumping elbows. At a light on Longfellow, I looked over at a runner in a bright shirt and remembered the day I ran that bridge to make room in my head for a sentence that had to carry weight. The river moved under us with that patient pull that tells you you are not in charge and you are not lost. At home, I hung the robe on its hook and set the watch on the little dish by the door. The house met me with the clean line of evening. I poured a glass of water and stood by the sink. In the quiet, I could hear the low hum of a city that has learned to argue without breaking the table. I thought about a dinner where a word was thrown like a stone and about every choice since that had been a hand open instead of a fist. Honor does not come back to you all at once. It walks up the path and knocks and waits until you answer with something better than pride. If you were shamed at your own family table, would you choose revenge or the truth? Tell me the moment you took your honor back and the lesson you want to leave for your children and your grandchildren.